Today we're going to be talking about universalism and particularism. And I want to tell you a story of somebody who was a fan of universalism, but in the end could not escape his particularism. The man's name was Lazer Zamenhof, later known as Ludwig Zamenhof. He was a Jewish man born in Bialystok, which was in the Russian Empire, but the Polish part of the Russian Empire, sometimes Ukraine, sometimes Poland. You know, these lines moved quite a bit over time, as we know. And in Bialystok, there were a wide variety of languages that were spoken. Of course, he grew up speaking Yiddish. He was also taught Russian at a very early age. Many of the peasantry around him spoke Ukrainian or Polish. Some spoke German because it was also reasonably close to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it was a polyglot city. And in remembering that time, when he was later older and looked back at his youth, he said that a lot of the disputes that came out during that period were communication, lack of connection, or hostility between the communities. And he thought, maybe there's a way that I can solve at least one of those problems. If I can find a way to help people communicate with each other with some kind of international language that everybody speaks, then maybe we'll solve some of these conflicts between peoples. Ultimately, he developed what he initially called a universal language. It ultimately became known as Esperanto. And his first formal grammar work on this was published in 1887. He actually also published a grammar of Yiddish at one point, but that's more or less forgotten given his lifelong work to support and promote Esperanto. Esperanto was based on Romance languages. I mean, it sounds vaguely like Spanish, but it has 7 or 8 basic rules and no exceptions to those rules, and everything else is just vocabulary and basic conjugations. It's actually a relatively easy language to learn. By comparison, English is one of the world's hardest languages to learn. Chinese is also one of the hardest languages to learn, and Hebrew is one of the hardest languages to learn. And then there are languages like Finnish and Basque and Hungarian, which seem to come out of nowhere and have no relationship with other languages. Armenian is another one of those sort of unique unicorn languages that don't have any connection to anywhere. Well, Esperanto was easy by comparison. And so you'd think it would have set the world afire, right? Well, the problem was that they would have conferences in Esperanto with lectures in Esperanto and poetry in Esperanto and music in Esperanto. And then the conference would end and everyone would switch back to speaking Yiddish. Now, that's a bit of a joke. Because there were non-Jews who were interested in Esperanto too. But it also reflects the reality that often when there's an internationalizing, universalizing initiative, it seems that Jewish people tend to rush in very early. We'll talk about that tendency in a little bit. As of today, according to the internet, there are about 2 million people who speak Esperanto to some degree of fluency. And there's about 1,000 people who are native Esperanto speakers. Now, out of 8 billion people, 1,000 people speaking it is not particularly successful. But that wasn't his goal. He wasn't trying to create native Esperanto speakers. He wanted to use it as a second language for everybody. It turns out the world's second language at this point is basically English. There's over 1 billion people who speak some level of fluency in English. You'll know that if you ever call customer service for a tech company, right, you're going to get people speaking some variety of fluency of English who are answering your questions from who knows where in the world. But that's become sort of a lingua franca. Of course, we should also know that there's about, I think, 1.5 billion speakers of English in the world, but that means there's also 6.5 billion people who don't speak any English. So there really is no universal lingua franca. We should also remember that there are other languages that serve as a second language. Indonesian, for example, is a somewhat artificial language that was created to create unity among all these different peoples that are part of this huge collection of islands that make up Indonesia. Now, I'll also point out that Zamenhof wasn't even the most successful person of his generation coming from Eastern Europe who was successful in the field of language. In fact, someone who you could argue has much more success than Zamenhof is the person who revived Hebrew as a modern language, who was born 1 year before Ludwig Zamenhof. Zamenhof was 1859. Eliezer ben Yehuda was born in 1858. And he decided he wanted to help the rebirth of modern Hebrew. He moved to the land of Israel in the 1880s, right around the same time that Zamenhof was trying to promote Esperanto. He wrote a dictionary. He refused to speak to his children in any language other than Hebrew, forcing them to learn this is a fluent language. He ultimately inspired a whole generation of people to adopt it as their second language, so it would be their child's first language. It's an interesting transition in that direction. And today there are about 9 million speakers of Hebrew, again, to varying degree of fluencies around the world. That includes Israelis who've left Israel, that includes Americans who learn some Hebrew, that includes Arabs who live in Israel but who speak some Hebrew, and of course immigrants to Israel who learn some Hebrew along the way. So if you have 9 million speakers, you're doing better than 2 million speakers, and 7 million of those speakers are fluent in it. So that's, I would argue, a substantial success. Now, I mentioned at the outset that Zamenhof tried to escape, but didn't. Zamenhof was an internationalist. He actually wrote a book on his religious philosophy that he basically called Humanism, which was based on the golden rule of do not do to other people what you would not suffer, as Rabbi Hillel formulated it. But he wanted to universalize it beyond just being Jewish. At one time, there was an organization of Jewish Esperanto speakers that invited Zamenhof to join them, and he said, no, thank you. He didn't want to be pigeonholed as one person. He was what you might call a citizen of the world, a universalist. But sometimes we don't get to decide these things. Ludwig Zamenhof lies buried today in the Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. So even if you want to be as universalist as you can, sometimes someone's going to bury you, and maybe it's your family, or maybe it's a cultural verdict, and that's where you wind up. Now, Jewish religion historically contained a paradox. On one hand, it claimed that there was only one God of all the universe. But it also claimed that that one God had chosen only one people, like a tribal God would choose them. In fact, it makes sense because Yahweh evolved as a tribal God and then ultimately fired all the other gods in the pantheon, so he was the only one left. But the reality is that what was left with this God is this odd paradox of a tribal God that's supposedly the only one there is. But that pulls this theology in two directions. On one hand, is this God's revelation, his teachings, his prophets, aimed at the entire world? Or is it focused only on its special people? Is Judaism, as the religion articulating the message of this God, is Judaism intended to be an or lagoyim, a light unto the nations? And are the sacred spaces of this organization a house of prayer for all peoples, quoting from Isaiah in both cases? Or on the other hand, is this nation intended to be an am segulai, people set apart, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, in the words of Exodus 19? Well, it's a paradox there. Universal God, particular people, universal message or particular message that's after all given in Hebrew, which almost nobody can understand and is very hard to learn. Now, there are religious traditions built on this model of Jewish monotheism that did have universal aspirations. Think of Christianity, think of Islam. Now, their universalism was sometimes by conquest, sometimes by conversion, certainly not by gentle persuasion. But they did have a universal message. If they have one God with one message for everybody, we should spread it to everybody as much as possible. Again, it's very different from the Jewish attitude. Now, Jews did allow converts and indeed encourage them in a certain period of time, but it was never a missionizing religion that was sending out pilgrims to go find benighted backward peoples and bring them the light. That was just not a part of Jewish culture. So the reality is that Judaism was never the universalist religion that these other religions became. But in the 21st century, the universalist temptation that most Jews deal with is not based on religion. There are Jews who convert to Christianity or Islam or Baha'i or other religions that are multi-ethnic because they want to get beyond their parochial identity. But most Jews who are tempted to be universalist are looking to get beyond human divisions. Divisions by religion, divisions by nationality, divisions by race or ethnicity. They hear the word tribe and they think it's tribalism. It's backward and dangerous and unethical. They want to be just a human being. In fact, it was funny, at one time, the leadership of most of the secular universalist organizations in North America were all people of Jewish background. the head of the American Ethical Union, Howard Radis, the head of the Center for Inquiry and the Council for Secular Humanism, Paul Kurtz, Sherwin Wine at the Society for Humanistic Judaism. But Kurtz and Radis were also of Jewish background, but they had decided, I'm just a person, I'm a universalist. Another word for universalist, or just a human being, would be the word cosmopolitan. The word cosmopolitan has two roots to it: cosmos, as in universal, and polis, as in city or citizen. So a cosmopolitan is someone who's part of world culture, is connected to the world, and in some ways is a citizen of the world. Now, this sometimes became a slur, often directed against Jews, by the way, of being a rootless cosmopolitan. A rootless cosmopolitan has no loyalties to anybody, is not patriotic, and only works on their own, crass self-interest or in a global perspective. You might hear, by the way, people today complain about globalists and how dangerous globalists are and the globalist agenda. Sometimes it's a euphemism for Jews, but sometimes it's also simply an expression of talking about people who don't want borders, who want to live anywhere in the world, who see the attraction of just being a human being and not having what they call tribal loyalties. Some of this is a result of the secular revolutions of science in the 16th and in the 17th and 18th century, the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th century, all of these intellectual shifts that helps people to think more in terms of universal human experience than parochial religious tradition or ethnic culture. This is a universalizing ideal. Now, at this point, I wanted to ask all of us a discussion question, and that is, why might someone want to leave their particular identity behind? What are some of the challenges to trying to maintain a particular identity that might make you want to simply become a citizen of the world, to leave that parochialism behind? Okay. There we go. Yes, you can certainly be persecuted by that identity, and so you want to escape the persecution, so you might be tempted into this universalist approach.
Well, I'd say it goes the other side of what Laurie said. Not only do you want to escape your own persecution, you want to separate yourself from any persecutions that are identified from your ethnicity.
You mean, so you neither want to be persecuted or to persecute other people?
Right. You want to get rid of the entirety. Not only do you not want to receive it, you don't want to generate any persecutions based on ethnicity, so you identify universally.
Okay.
You also are freed from the labeling and the stereotypical behavior of others towards you if you are more universally oriented. You're, as you said before, you're a person of the world, not of this group, that group, or some other group. So you want to sort of escape that kind of stereotyping and marginalization.
Right. You can change your name, you can change your nose, right?
Yes.
Although what's interesting is a lot of families, this is a really interesting insight historical studies produced. There's all these stories about families whose names were changed at Ellis Island because some clerk couldn't write or couldn't read the name or something. It's actually not true. The vast majority of people whose names were changed as immigrants did so themselves. They went to court and they petitioned to change it because they were trying to escape the persecution of having a Jewishly identified name. And they were sort of ashamed that they had to do that, or that they chose to do that. So they made up the story about the clerk at Ellis Island. I mean, Ellis Island, you had to speak multiple languages to get a job as a clerk there. And it's not like nobody knew how to speak or read Yiddish in New York at the time. So they certainly could have gotten translators. But the reality was that people changed it more to avoid persecution than the imposition from outside.
My understanding.
1 second, James. Yeah, go ahead.
My understanding is that some changes were made at the port of embarkation on the ship manifest. Was the first time the altered name appeared.
Yes, it could also be on the manifest. Yeah, James, go ahead.
I was going to say another reason someone could, identify with the universalist is because they're trying to essentially encourage more people to do it, because philosophically they think the world should get rid of these delineations and just see people as human beings. And they think that, well, if I can, get enough, if I can do it myself and get enough people to join me, maybe we can make this more of a thing.
Right, you want to be the Pied Piper, come on. And if you decide that separatism between groups is what creates hostilities, then you don't want to contribute to that, and you don't want to be a part of that, and you don't want to encourage others to do the same to you. Other thoughts on why you might want to move along into the universal world? Maybe it's the direction you think history is going to move, and you want to be in the vanguard. This is the future, and I'm an early adopter. I'm the one with the first iPhone and the and the electric car.
It's interesting for me. I have had personal experience of white privilege and benefiting from it. When I got out of school, my first job, I became very close friends with an African-American artist. And he stood up for my wedding, which created quite a ruckus at a Jewish wedding. But
Right.
We liked folk music together, and we would go to various places like the Gate of Horn, and the black entertainers, when they saw us, every time they went on break, they came down and talked to us and said, "What's with you guys? Nobody's doing that anymore." So but obviously in a more universal world, everybody could benefit from that. Everybody could be friends with anybody they wanted. But in this case, it actually, the bigotry actually worked as a weird advantage. But I think people would like to escape all that kind of stuff, all the
Yeah.
labeling and the garbage that goes with it. So
Right. So other comments include the Thomas Paine quote, "My country is the world, my religion is to do good," or you're just sick of all the rules and limits of those identities, and you want to get beyond it. It might be that you're worried that having a group will make you a racist or chauvinist, or the flip side is maybe you feel guilty that I'm caring for my group too much and I'm not being a good enough neighbor to everybody. If it's love your neighbor could be anybody. Actually, I saw a very interesting quote by Joachim Prinz, who was a Reform rabbi, Holocaust refugee, and actually was part of the March on Washington in 1963, or 61, sorry. And he was quoted as saying that the neighbor and love your neighbor is not geography, it's a moral category, it's a concept. And I thought that was an interesting way to think about that. And also, when you identify as part of a group loyalty goes two ways. I mean, you can be proud when people of your group do something wonderful, but also if people of your group do something terrible, do you feel, ashamed, guilty? Are you swept up in that judgment? It has, a benefit and a risk to it. So let's say you've decided, okay, fine. There's all these problems with a particular identity. I want to leave that behind. What are some of the attractions, the positive attractions to becoming a total universalist, a 100% cosmopolitan?
Positives about being absorbed?
Yeah, about being a universalist.
Well, it's interesting because I was going to add, and I was muted, personal circumstance, which is I had my only uncle on my dad's side, Schoenbrod is my maiden name, and never changed. Anyway, his middle name was Gilbert, and he was a lawyer and became a judge, and he dropped Schoenbrod, and so he was Judge Gilbert. And I think there was little tolerance for that, but I will say that things that I didn't understand when I was younger, I've understood more and more as I aged. He was a judge for the National, Labor Relations Board. And my mother, I kind of indirectly knew this, whatever, was just really proud when she passed. A phrase used commonly for Blacks that passed as whites, when she passed as non-Jewish. I mean, she married a Jewish man, but I will say that over the decades, as I've understood more, read more, whatever, I understand that more, the comfort of that, of being able to merge. and the dissing, as my kids would say, of their own backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, there is sort of a love-hate relationship there where you want to be part of a broader humanity, but sometimes it requires denying where you come from. But if you're not happy with where you came from, it's not always all negative. My favorite joke about this is this Jewish family joins a very waspy country club, and they manage to get in. And one day they're out for a ride in a canoe, and the canoe tips over, and the one of the partners cries out because the water's really cold. She says, "Oi, gewalt," whatever that means, because she, realizes she's outed herself there.
I will also add that my parents were the first Jewish people to be allowed to reside in an old co-op in Chicago. Very much old moneyed, whatever. And I remember that when they were admitted, and then another subsequent Jewish family from Glencoe were admitted. But I remember the advice my mother got, which was she should wear a kind of an old kind of nubby cashmere sweater when she went for the interview. They had to be interviews to be accepted by the board to be residents, to purchase this apartment.
Yep.
Yeah, very, very mixed.
So
How not to deny, but survive.
So one of the attractions of becoming a cosmopolitan is you can get in anywhere. You can socialize with anyone. You could, in theory, date anyone, marry anyone. You could live anywhere. You can experience any kind of culture, any kind of food, right? The world is your oyster, and it's all yours because you're a human like everybody else. Bob,
Do you really believe that's possible?
well, that's a different question.
Well, I mean,
Whether it's
because I
possible.
just think about the way we operate as human beings, our science, everything, identify things, name them, sort them out.
Oh, sure. I mean, we'll talk about human group psychology a little bit later, but yes, there is something of the impossible dream in this vision of a pure cosmopolitan universalism. But yeah, we'll talk about some of the downsides to cosmopolitanism too. There's an old saying, goes back to actually an African slave who was in Rome, who was quoted as saying, "Nothing human is alien to me." Right? Anything that's part of the human experience can be connected to me, and I can experience it, and it's part of the human experience writ large. Also, I think there's a moral statement that people are making when they want to be universalist. They want to have a connection with all humanity. They want to have sympathy, equal sympathy and concern for every human being, and not be only focused on their particular. There's a marvelous short story by Philip Roth called "The Conversion of the Jews," where a young boy keeps getting called into the rabbi's office because he says appalling things that really upset his mother or his neighbors or his friends. And so one of the things he did that got him called into the rabbi's office was there was a plane crash in the New York area, and in the paper they printed all the names of the people who had died in the plane crash. And his mother was going through the list of names, marking the Jewish names and counting how many Jewish names were on the list. And her son said, "I wish they were all Jewish." And so, of course, she's appalled. She takes him to rabbi. What, he wants more Jews to die? What is he saying? What he was really saying is, I wish you cared for all of them the way you care about the Jewish names. So there's a moral argument that you're making by being a cosmopolitan to say that I have full concern for all peoples. There was a writer named Rosa Luxemburg, a political thinker, who famously in a letter to a friend said, "You're writing to me about this Jewish suffering, and I am, I'm a citizen of the world. I suffer for the people on the rubber plantations and the people working in the mines. And don't come to me with your particular Jewish suffering. I suffer with all human beings. Wherever there is sweat and tears and blood, that's where my heart is." So don't be particular, but it's a moral argument to say that we are concerned for everybody. It also gives you a universal ethic, right? And it allows you to learn from all peoples. If there's equal moral concern for everybody, there's equal potential for contributing to the vast store of knowledge of humanity. Some people come to their cosmopolitanism through science, because science is a global endeavor. I don't know if you remember the 1990s movie Contact with Jodie Foster. There's a really interesting scene in there that gets at this, where she's all of a sudden detected a signal from an alien civilization, and it's obvious that it's counting prime numbers. So it's not a randomly repeating thing. It's someone showing intelligence in this radio signal. But after a few hours, the Earth is rotating, and she's going to lose the signal. So she hands it off to an Australian, SETI installation, and they keep tracking of the signal. And someone from the U.S. government comes in and says, "Why did you give that up? This was our proprietary national security information." And she said, "But the world is turning, and this is a universal human. This isn't an American interest to contact an alien civilization. This is human." And I thought that was a really nice encapsulation of this dynamic of science as a route to universalism. And for some people, that's how they get to their cosmopolitan ethic. Ultimately, there's a Hebrew poem that we've used sometimes in our services that says very simply how it works. Achi Adam, my brother is humanity. Artsi Olam, my land is the world. Dati Yofi, my faith is beauty. That's where I get inspiration. And that's the universal ethos for the cosmopolitan. So with all those positives said, there are challenges to cosmopolitanism. We already had a couple of them mentioned. Bob was talking about our psychological tendency to be focused on groups and to define ourselves as groups. And Lori mentioned the risk of losing your roots. And for some people, they figure, what's the point of roots? Life is lived forward, not backwards. And I don't live my responsibility is to my children, not to my parents, okay, or to my grandparents or to my ancestors way back. I need to look forward, and so maybe I make different choices for them. But even if you decide to live forward, you can't erase your memories, at least not yet. You can't erase your emotional attachments to the culture of origin, the song that your grandmother sang you. I've told the story before. The first time I fed my daughter as an infant Gerber baby food bananas, I opened the container, and the smell brought me instantly back to my grandmother's banana bread, which she used Gerber baby food bananas to make it creamy and soft. But the smell, the taste, it was instantly brought back. I can't erase though. That's part of my connection to my grandmother, and I have memories of my parents with Hanukkah menorahs and Passover seders. That's part of who I am. And honestly, family attachments, those kind of emotional attachments, aren't rational, but they're part of what makes us human too. It's not just our Enlightenment style rational mind, it's also these emotional attachments. And the family not being rational reminds me of another story that was part of my mother's experience. So my mom grew up in a very Jewish leftist family. They were socialists, they were universalists, they were very Yiddish connected, but they also had this sort of universal ethic. They were very much in favor of civil rights, even in the 50s, before it was popular. And then she brought home a black date to a family event. And her grandmother read her the Riot Act. And she said, well, what do you mean? Okay, anyway, so her grandmother hits the roof. How dare you? And my mom is perplexed. We've always, talked about civil rights and so on. And her grandmother said to her, there are only two black men in the world you would be allowed to marry. One is if you were president of the United States, and the other is Harry Belafonte. Because Harry Belafonte was very active in civil rights and sung Hava Nagila and all that, right? So he was the other path. So sometimes these attachments, you can be as universal as you want, but then when it's a son-in-law or grandkids, then it becomes a little bit more tricky. Other thoughts on some of the challenges to going off and being a pure cosmopolitan?
I just wanted to add to your story. My sister had a friend whose parents were adamant that she only date Jewish people. And she went to college, she brought home a black Jew, and they lost it, like your grandmother, and then they never said anything about it again. But
that's fine.
She said, but he's Jewish. And they were like, you know,
Well, that shows you when Jews get the chance to become white,
yeah, really.
they sometimes take it. Well, one of the reasons to think twice is that the idea of, charging ahead and having no one behind you, the Esperantists that were all speaking Yiddish, Jews have been so pulled into these universalist movements sometimes that they were overrepresented there. And not every other people follows them. The International Workers' Order was an American communist organization. They had different language sections. And the Yiddish language section was one of 17 different sections, but it was larger than any 3 of the other language sections put together. And don't forget that there were some Jews in the Russian section and some Jews in the English section too. So really there were large numbers of Jews in this organization because they were attracted to this internationalist approach, but other people stay behind. So I have one friend who put it very well. She said, I would love it if all the barriers for all the different ethnicities would disappear and we'd all be one brotherhood of humanity. The Jews will go number 12. Historically, we've gone number 1 and only. Let's let the Bosnians give up their culture, and then let the Hutus give up their culture, and then we'll let the Sri Lankans, leave behind their distinct culture, and then we'll go number 12. We're happy to go number 12. But all too often, we're number 1 and no one's behind us. We also have to realize that a lot of universalism actually is kind of cultural imperialism. If you ask people, what is global music? They'll often think of classical music, right? But that's not Yoruba drumming. That's not Chinese flutes. And to a Western ear sometimes that doesn't sound like music to them, but it's beautiful to people living in that culture. So, this idea that there's a universal ideology, but there isn't in many cases. It's a version of European culture that people assume is universal. And the flip side of that is if you want to be part of every culture in the world, now you run the risk of something else. It's called cultural appropriation, where you say, well, I'm part of all of human culture, and so I can use anything from anywhere no matter what. So if I like Japanese art and decor, I can decorate my house however I want to, and I can wear whatever clothes I want to, and I can sing whatever songs I want to, and that's a universalizing claim, but in some cases people have objected to this as what is now called cultural appropriation, where you're using other people's cultures without sufficient respect for where it comes from. And going to a restaurant and experiencing it is one thing. Going to a cultural education program is another thing. But simply adopting it willy-nilly as world culture and I'm a human and I can do anything humans do, that gets more complicated. Or sometimes you experience other cultures and you get snooty. They're backward. I'm a universalist. Anybody that wants to be distinct is backward, is primitive. And why can't they leave it behind? I once gave a talk at an ethical humanist society where somebody there who was of Jewish background but had left it behind said, why can't you do that? I've taken this evolutionary step. I've left behind this primitive identity. Why don't you do that? And I said, well, I don't think it's primitive. And I don't think it's a barrier to being part of world culture, as we'll talk about in just a minute. Somebody said, maybe you want the world to be like this, so you want to take steps in that direction. But if everyone became a cosmopolitan and was part of a universal culture, what would we lose? We'd lose all those distinct national cultures. Think about food. I ate at a wonderful Indian restaurant today. But if it all became world culture, there'd be no Indian food. There'd be no fusion cuisine of Indian-Chinese combo. One of the best meals I've ever had at one of those sort of street, food truck kind of setups was an egg roll with lamb biryani, Indian food, inside of it that I dipped in Greek tzatziki sauce. It was awesome. And it takes 3 distinct cultures to come together to make that fusion cuisine, where if it's all universal culture, it's all Applebee's, you know, like it's blah and it's boring. And you're losing something there. So for whatever the problems of distinct cultures, of particularism, there are benefits too, and we would lose those if everything became just universal.
Also, isn't, your example about the black fiance, it's a lot easier to think these things than it is to change your behavior. Changing behavior is a complex, difficult task for anybody. And even to align your behavior with what you believe is very difficult. So, I think people forget that part about it too. That
Right. It's one of these nice theory, but how is it going to play out in practice? And as you said earlier, is it realistic to even think about this? And you get down to the very practical level and you start asking questions like, what are your holidays? I mean, yes, you can do the winter solstice and the summer solstice and the equinox. So those are universal because they're solar based. You can create holidays based on famous people like Charles Darwin or Albert Einstein, pick their birthdays or their death dates and do something around there. You can try and find dates of universal significance. But in many cases, they're going to feel kind of artificial or invented. And I know that's how all religion starts, right? That's how all culture starts, is it's made up at some point. But I don't know, there's something about a Hanukkah menorah that's different from a Darwin Day speaker. And the French Revolution tried to do this, by the way. They actually tried to reorganize the calendar so it'd be 10 days in a week. But people didn't like having 9 days of work and 1 day off. They missed the old calendar. But they also made a whole calendar. Remember how the Catholics have a saint for every day? They created a calendar of secular saints, of scientists and artists and philosophers, and they dedicated each day to a particular person. So you want a saint's calendar? Here you go. We'll make up a saint's. It doesn't take, right? It doesn't last. And so there's a limit to what you can invent from whole cloth, and then claim it's meaningful. Sometimes it works, right? There are new observances, or relatively new observances, that begin to take root. Whether it's Martin Luther King Day or observances of Juneteenth, which are relatively new to the non-Black community, but are becoming more understood. So things do change. You certainly get new observances that develop. Obviously, people mark September 11th a very different way than they did, previously, when it was just my friend Ken Burke's birthday. And it was a day in the calendar, but now 9/11 is something else. So dates happen. But in the end, having this sense of roots is actually a positive thing. So let's turn finally to the positives of being in connection with a particular group. After all, if we're connected to a humanistic Jewish congregation, we've made a choice to be part of a particular group and not just a universalist humanist. What are some of the positives of staying connected to a particular group, be it a religion or an ethnicity or a culture, or even just a particular family?
Well, speaking from my own experience, it creates a community that you can be part of, and of like-minded people. You don't have to agree on everything, certainly, but I mean, you're not going to. But it's a comfort zone area in a sense, and it's a community. I mean, and that's why a lot of people belong to churches and things, because they had a community out of it, and a supportive community for life events like birth and death and marriage and just emotional things if you have problems.
Yeah, evolutionary psychologists suspect that our survival groups, when we were, in our earliest hunter-gatherer stage, were usually around 1 to 200 people. So that's about the size of our immediate moral concern in our hardwiring, what we've evolved to manage. And when we get to super huge groups, we either need to find a mechanism to feel part of the group, like you go to a baseball game and you all sing the national anthem, or take me out to the ball game at a certain point and you feel part of the group. Or you wear team insignias, right? Or you clap at the same time, or you cheer at the same. So you find ways to feel part of the group, or you find ways to make the group smaller. You go to a university with 40,000 undergraduates, You can't just relate to all the students. You join a club, you join a fraternity, you join an activity, you participate in a sport, you wind up with roommates, right? You find ways to break down that size to a group that we can connect with. And if 40,000 of people who are basically the same age as you is too much, imagine 8 billion people with all these different, like, it's just too big. We need a small group to feel who we are. And to get, as Laurie said, our needs for community and connection met in some way. Other thoughts on the benefits of being part of a group?
It's just psychologically satisfying. I mean, it's at a base level, it just feels good. And I mean, doing a specific type of ritual or eating a specific type of food within a group and feeling that connection is gives a feeling of goodness and safety and connection. And you can tell there was clearly like some sort of tie to some evolutionary benefit in the past, because it's like we're hardwired to, it's like having a nice hot beverage on a cold day. It just feels good.
Yeah. Feeling of rootedness, feeling of connection. It's also a kind of natural transcendence, right? You feel connected to something larger than yourself. It doesn't have to be a god or anything supernatural, but it's certainly part of something beyond your own particular experience that makes you feel like you either have roots in the past or legs into the future. I mean, think about children who've been adopted, who want to find out, where did I come from, their birth families, people who go through DNA testing and find insights into their past, sometimes disturbing, sometimes enlightening, that change their sense of who they are. You know, where do I come from is a basic question, and knowing that, feeling rooted in your family history and culture, or the culture you've adopted and chosen, it really helps you feel part of something bigger than yourself, and who you are is defined not only by you as an individual, but also by your group connections. I mean, we know that family sense can go astray. You know, what does the mafia call its units? They're the family, right? And when you're in the family, you get treated well. But if you're in a different family, or you're outside the family, or you betray the family, then all bets are off and we treat them terribly. That's again where there's a balancing act here of care for the in-group and not cruelty to the out-group, if you can find the right balance. And I'll mention one other advantage, or two other advantages to leaning into your particular culture. I mentioned that if everyone were cosmopolitan, there'd be no distinct cultures, right? That would be a loss. But if you are living in your particular culture, you can lean into the particular beauties of that culture, the experiences that are distinct from that particular experience, that particular background. And I heard one scholar describe Judaism as if it were a piccolo in a large orchestra, right? One of the smallest instruments. And if you play it too loud, it's harsh and grating. But if you play it right, it harmonizes with other groups. And if we didn't play the piccolo, there would be no piccolo. And that unique sound would no longer be part of the chorus of humanity. So there are unique beauties to particular cultures that you're allowed to lead into. And here's the last point, and this is ultimately the takeaway message for you. Because people tend to live in groups, because most people in the world are not cosmopolitan, they come from a distinct culture, religion, ethnicity, family experience. If you can understand your own in an open-minded way, then it's a basis for positive connections with other people who have their own particular culture, experience, heritage, and identity. Oh, you have this coming of age ceremony, we have the bar bat or the bar mitzvah. You do this for your wedding ceremonies, here's what we do for ours. You have this particular food in the spring, we have that. You find parallels to their experience. It's a bridge to understanding. Where if you're a pure universalist who said, oh, you're still doing that backward coming of age ritual, that's ridiculous, because we understand how the genetics work and your pituitary gland is not active enough. And, you know, that you're undermining a basis for common experience as opposed to building one. So ultimately what we hope for, as we're leaning into this balance, is a kind of open particularism, or you might call it a rooted cosmopolitan. There's an author, a philosopher named Kwame Appiah that has written a book by that title, but the basic idea is that you are allowed to have a broad perspective on the world, to experience world cultures, to be open to other peoples, while still having a foot in your own roots. You know where you come from, but have a broad experience of the world. It's like learning the map of your hometown and then traveling. They are not mutually exclusive. You can do both. You can feel at home in your town and also understand things about the wider world. And that's really our ideal, is to not live in a ghetto that we put around ourselves, to leave that ghetto, but to know where we come from and to be able to return to that in space for the positives we get out of it. And hopefully to leave behind the negatives we don't want to have to bring along with us. So any last thoughts on this dynamic of universalism and particularism?
I only wanted to add that when you belong to a group, you very often can get things done, sometimes beneficial things, sometimes not. But I was thinking, for example, as individuals, we might not do mitzvahs, but as a group, we do a mitzvah day, and they're encouraged to do that because the group is doing that.
Right, right. Yeah, groups can certainly push you to do things for others.
And all along, I had trouble with the two as a dichotomy, because it seems to me that respect for others means accepting their groups and expecting them to accept your group, and doing so in an all-inclusive way.
Right, right. Well, obviously it was a false, it was a false dichotomy. And we understand that it can tend in that direction. We also understand that there are times that there is a conflict. Yeah. You know, that what's good for your group might not be good for everybody, or your concern for your group might take precedence. I mean, I don't think that people who hear about a disaster and look at the Jewish names, or who look at the American citizen, a ferry sinks in Indonesia that killed 80 people and including 3 Americans. I don't think that's inherently a terrible thing, that you have some concern for the people with whom you have political ties or loyalties or connections. I mean, after all, there's an idea of citizenship and non-citizenship, and I don't expect people in France to care as much about me as I expect Americans to care about me.
For me, it's all right to have that initial reaction, but then it's important to recognize that those other 77 were also real people and deserve as much compassion, and their families as much support as the 3 Americans.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same balancing act of caring for your family versus other people. I mean, I could empty out our pantry and give all of our food to a food shelter, and then my kids would be hungry going to bed. And, that's caring for humanity, sometimes to the abstraction of the family loyalty. I mean, you think about people in the Soviet Union in George Orwell's 1984, where the kids turn in the parents, right? Because they're loyal to the state, they're loyal to the big picture, to humanity, but not to the family. And we find something off with that. So it's again finding that balance of treating other people like legitimate people, but I'm allowed to care for my mother in the hospital differently than I care for anybody else. There was actually a really fascinating article in the New York Public, this is now 25 years ago, I think, about a philosopher named Peter Singer. Peter Singer is a really interesting thinker who tries to carry things through to their logical conclusions. So he's a sort of a bugaboo in the disability rights movement, because he said that people in a persistent vegetative state should have less rights than a smart dog or a monkey or a dolphin. If you're measuring rights based on cognition, then obviously vegetarianism is what you should do. But not only that, there's a sliding scale of rights. So a person in a persistent vegetative state with no meaningful brain activity shouldn't have the same rights that a conscious, intelligent, living being should have. But the article about him was called Other People's Mothers, because it turns out that Peter Singer's mother had a degenerative dementia disease, and in the end did not know herself from anyone else. And he was a very dutiful son, and he cared for her all the way to the end, and he did not look for assisted suicide or any other kind of means to terminate her life early. he was very attentive to her, as you would think is a good action, a moral action from a child to a parent. But the question that the article asked was, so was his philosophical theory just about other people's mothers and not his own? So this writ large is that balance of group identity and universalism. I agree with you that the impulse is one thing, then you have a broader picture, but I'm not willing to say that all preference for the in-group is inherently a bad thing. I think it's natural, and I think it does have positive results. And honestly, this was an interesting argument by a liberal for nationalism. If you're part of a large group, like a national group, a citizenship group, it encourages you to give up things and sacrifice things for people you have no relationship to whatsoever. You serve in an army, you die in a military conflict to help people that you are not related to at all. It's like that famous line in The Godfather, Part 2, where Michael Corleone has left his mafia family to go join the army. And his brother Sonny says to him, "You're stupid, you're dying for strangers." But that's what being part of a national community is. You're willing to die for strangers, you're willing to help strangers, give your money for strangers. And so group identity can lead to altruism. We just have to keep expanding that group and then contracting it as necessary.